In this podcast, Pascal talks about how insurance companies could innovate. So stay tuned. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Future of Data podcast. Today we have a great guest, Pascal Marmier. He is a digital analytics catalyst at Swiss Re, and his bio. So after many years of helping to build the Swissnex network in Boston and in China, Pascal recently joined Swiss Re in Boston to help the digital analytics catalyst team identify and develop novel ideas, tech into sustainable business. As part of the digital transformation of the insurance industry, his team in Boston and London is engaging with startups and academia in various fields of technology such as digital health, IoT, AI. He is currently working with his team at Swiss Re to provide business solution based on the transformative power of data innovation. So, Pascal, thank you so much for agreeing to join our podcast. And as I was reading your quick bio, I think it was beautifully written by a marketer. So it has almost every keyword from Gartner's hype curve that you could ever find in current ecosystem, with almost every business that is seeing the angst of this evolution. So great job there. And I think as a starting, I would love to have you fill in whatever I have missed in this brief micro description of yourself.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks for having me on the podcast. Pleasure to share a little bit more. Not a lot to add. I mean, yes, there's keywords, there's hype, but I think in the end there's also a lot of work behind. And I think if there's one maybe constant in the work I think we all do, and I'm sure that the listener would relate to this, is building up strong relationship and meeting people and then just kind of learning from one another. So beyond maybe the hype of marketing is just from my side also the passion of exploring how different people intersect, and I have to say, and we'll cover this a little bit later, but the insurance industry has been full of those, and I got lucky to have different platforms and different regions to explore this over the years, including China, where a lot of things are happening, obviously, but let's dig in on the content and not stop on the Gartner hype cycle.
So well said, Pascal. So let's talk about your journey to where you are today. I think I was flabbergasted by looking at your background. We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast. Why don't you just walk us through your journey?
Yeah, so I grew up in a small place in Switzerland, and when you're in probably the number one country for quality of life and others, you don't want to venture out, right? So eventually I made my way to Boston because of the pool of the graduate schools here for what I believe would be a 10 months, I would say, stint or program doing corporate law. And then what happened is I was part of the, I would say, first wave of 1.0, the famous kind of .com activity, and this was permeating even the law school where I went, so that when I finished, I discovered an entire new world of ventures, of startups, of funding, and I decided to basically try to make something out of it. And that's where I basically started working with entrepreneurs, becoming a little bit familiar with technology, not from the standpoint, I would say, of a scientist, but more just, I would say, as a connector, as someone who likes to explore, again, the richness behind people's background and what they can do. So this materialized into what we call the first science and innovation considered. So taking the concept of old diplomacy and transforming it into something more high-tech than it ever was. So we built up an accelerator or incubator, as it was called at the time, for tech startup. We started bringing small and large companies into the Boston area, including my current employer. And we kind of rode the wave of this kind of tech development. This then brought me to China to do things similarly at a little bit of a different scale. As you can imagine, and different speeds. So we had the hardware innovation programs in the south of China. We had the kind of government-driven innovation policy work in Beijing, and then we had the software data novelties that were going on in Shanghai. And after doing this, it was a little bit of a stroke of luck, but I feel a little bit the same way, right? The insurance industry is certainly at the beginning of its digital transformation, if you want to use this word, or at least in terms of how technology can be there. But the potential is just fantastic. So this is the journey in short.
Wow. I think fascinating. So I think, by the way, I love your story. So the other gentleman with a law background ended up in somewhere around innovation and data that we had previously. He ended up becoming on cybersecurity. Very fitting law.
Oh, nice.
But I think yours is a very dynamic journey of innovation, transformation. So what sparked to get here, to sort of, what is that moment when you said, okay, maybe law is let me venture into the fascinating world of innovation and all that. So what was that moment?
No, I think it was just curiosity, as its most basic nature, right? I think we were a little bit covered in Switzerland by again, kind of the quality of life, the small scale of the place, so that when you kind of take a little bit of a broader approach, you discover what you've missed. So one of the fun story there was that I went to school probably less than a mile away from what is now one of the best engineering and by extension innovation school in Europe, called the EPFL. But I had to go to Boston to discover the strengths of a place like this. So I think it was just the reflection and going outside that showed a little bit the interest of things that were going on. And again, I mean, similarly, when I started discovering the world of insurance and reinsurance, I had no clue how many, I would say, links to society in general this industry is providing. So I can probably do this in a couple more industry, but I have to say it was really kind of the drive to explore that pushed me forward.
Nice. So let's venture into Swiss Re. So to our audience, what does Swiss Re do?
Yeah, so Swiss Re is a risk knowledge expert, if you want. We like to use the motto to say we want to make the world more resilient. So we are working with a group of stakeholders, obviously insurers. Insurers have different ways to seed us, as we say, or give us, if you want, the role to help them insure their own business, if you want. So it's kind of insurance for insurer itself. It can be because they want to free up some capital reserve to make more business, but typically reinsurance comes because we're there for the kind of extreme cases. If you follow a little bit the news, right, as soon as there's a natural catastrophe, the US had many over the years, you see the reinsurers kind of basically front to the claims adjudication and the payment and the reimbursement. So that means that by extension, if you look back, since we have high exposure, actually globally, reinsurance is really a global business, we need to understand extremely well the risk. And this is where the knowledge piece comes in. If you want to know and what's going to happen in terms of climate change across a region as vast, for example, of the East Coast of the US, you have to understand a lot of activities. So this is what reinsurers do on one side, right? And then on the other side, obviously we have a lot of capital to deploy. So it's kind of different asset allocation, and again, kind of a very strong financial engineering in terms of knowing reserves, capital allocation, where do you place your money. And all of this, of course, as you can see, is linked to knowledge of not only the world as it is, but of technology, of data. There's kind of different layers, if you want, that kind of permeates the whole industry. And typically, funnily enough, it's an industry that is in part non-US. I think the banks and the financial sector were the first one back in the 1900s to think about reinsurance. Switzerland had this ancestor of Swiss Re that was backed by the government. Another one of our competitors is called Munich Re, and we are the kind of global leaders when it comes to that.
Interesting. Thank you so much for walking us through what Swiss Re does. I think so. Let's get. I think one thing that I really like about your profile. So besides, I was fascinated with the title, Head Digital Analytics Catalyst. It's a mouthful. It's like every word in itself is a stream that's going out. And then, by the way, for insurance, right? So like the whole thing was like, wow, I need to bug you and get you to talk about some of the fun stuff. So what exactly is Head Digital Analytics Catalyst means, and what's your role, if you can walk us through that?
Right. So you're absolutely right. I think each word comes here for a reason, right? I mean, digital, I'm sure you've explored it into other episodes of your podcast, but it's definitely the wave that's going through some of the industry, right? You can think about healthcare, you can think about others. Think about it this way. I mean, insurance is basically something that in terms of customer experience, we've all done and experienced, but it's still something that requires papers and various, of course, transactions. We'll talk a little bit later about risk management, but the digital piece is really just kind of from an industry perspective, understanding that we have to rethink a little bit the value chain now that new technologies are bringing us, I would say, reasons to do so. And analytics brings the data piece, if you want, meaning that it's not only just kind of digital where you can bring external consultants and you will redo your value chains, but the analytics piece comes both on the risk side, the customer side, and if you want, for me, that's part of your kind of competitive strategy. This is where you can really kind of build up, if you want, the expertise that will make you stronger and really kind of a clear differentiator. And then the catalyst is just there because we are an innovation group, right? We have data scientists within the companies that are running models, that are exploring new ways of basically better identification, pricing of risk, go all the way to some other kind of creative ways to help clients. But our group and where Catalyst is there is really to serve a little bit at the boundary between the internal world of the company and the external world. So short, I would say summary would be to say we are the connectors in terms of data innovation for the group. So think of us as a corporate innovation lab with kind of the revolution taking place around data and kind of the new uses of data and sources of data as the kind of primary driver of what we do. So again, we're not using the kind of current tools, but we're looking at some of the innovation out there that would change the way that I think all of us work in the industry.
Interesting, and thank you so much for sharing that. I think one thing that I really like with the word catalyst or labs, or like it brings us to ideation and future of thinking and all that fun stuff. But when I see those words coming out of very legacy old companies, like insurance, very regulated, very careful on what to move next. When that industry talk about catalyst, what does the catalyst to those companies really mean? Like how do you cope up something like this? How do you plan to design something like, so if you have put on this task, hey, put up a great catalyst team so we can figure out the next opportunity, whether it's digital health, whether it's IoT, whether it's AI. How do you end up design? What are some of the things that you considered when you were designing a thing? Which team? How to put together the team? So what's your secret sauce there? If you can share
yeah, so I think we're very much an experiment. I think it's important to highlight this, right? It's now, we're counting our history in terms of month. The group itself, the strategy is always evolving. So I think we should be placed, if you want, both internally, but I mean more broadly as part of the experiment the industry is going through, right? If you look a little bit externally, you'll have the CVC, the corporate venture capital that will be there. You'll see some group doing partnerships. You'll see some group having kind of skunk works activities as such. And I would say we haven't made too much investment, but we've been a little bit given so far a little bit the mission, and if you want the freedom to think about which model would fit the best. And what's interesting is you could see different directions between what colleagues do in Europe and what we do here in the US. And you can see that with every interaction, both with our colleagues and also externally, we've been kind of doing new activities. So I would say on a very kind of concrete size, what we do is try to do really two things. Either find sources of partnerships that basically can advance us towards our clients, for example. So if people do better risk analysis, if people do, I don't know, in the life and health space, if they know better exactly what Vishal's health is compared to some of the other, that's one aspect. And then the other aspect is really trying to think, okay, can we take one of the big topic of the day and break it down to the size of something that we can pilot, right? That's where I think the lab piece comes in. Is the industry, Swiss Re has been really good at strong products that can be rolled out, and others. I think it's really difficult to go to 1 billion projects using technology without having some of the intermediary step of piloting, refining, experimenting, scaling up, and others. So we are at the piece where we're experimenting. To give you just one example, one of the topic we like is the sharing economy, and we've been now working on and trying to see, is there a different ways to offer services to platforms of the sharing economy than it is currently, right? You were in a very nice office, in a very nice home. If you wanted to go and rent your home, sure enough, your home insurance policy is not going to cover this, right? There's going to be holes in there. And the sharing economy we've seen with Uber and others, they're kind of shaking a little bit the kind of regulatory world, if you want. And sure enough, from an insurance perspective, it's the same way. So taking this, we're trying to rebuild, if you want, how this could look like from a digital insurance perspective, right? And rather than using, I think you used the word kind of legacy and regulatory, rather than worrying too much about this, is really more kind of borrowing from, travel industries and others where they've been really able to kind of digitize and move forward. So this is where we come in. So these are kind of the if you want the project size. One other area that we can explore in more depth, if you would like, is also that we are trying to bring this innovation, a little bit kind of design thinking to the company. So one part is working on the projects, the other part is certainly working also on a kind of different approach of innovation internally, changing a little bit the culture of how we work, which we find also as a great mission for our team.
We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast. Interesting. So I think this is one of the primal requests from most of our audience. So they are asked to put up something like a lab framework to make sure that they have a shorter route to ideation. They can execute something quickly. They can sniff something quickly and react on it rapidly. And almost like we find ourselves in those conversations many times of what are the first 3 to 4 or to 5 steps that we could do, excuse me, to sort of execute on this vision of whether you call it catalyst, whether you call it lab. So like now considering your example, so if say I am coming into a very regulated industry with a very cultural sensitive ecosystem, and I'm asked to put up a lab, like what are the 2 to 3 thoughts that would come to your mind to help me execute it better or something? If you can share something.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's any classic formula. And again, I would put a label to my comments as saying we're running the experiment as we go.
Right.
But one of the obvious first step is executive sponsorship in one way or another, right?
Beautiful.
You need to have this for a few reasons. You want to have a little bit of budget if you can. You want to be also kind of shielded maybe from the interference of day to day. You want to be having KPIs and ways of working that are certainly different from the rest of the organization, and you want to get people excited about what you do and not have to kind of be on the defensive. So that's the first one, I would say. The second one, which I found interesting, also in our case, others have seen this, but it's really kind of linking through then kind of different groups, different business unit, having the potential, and this is really something that I found fascinating, to create some sort of this cross-functional, a little bit teams that could join together on projects. So having a little bit like the movie producers, the role of creating the cast and having the understanding from again, kind of the executive level, but also the teams that you can create some of this, I think has been terrific. And then I think the third one, just to throw in another one, is have this opening to the kind of external world, because I think this is also how you basically explore and in the end kind of use the external ideas. So it can take any form, right? We have some partnerships with Accelerator. We've been working with some academic groups as well, whatever you want to do. But you basically need to have a little bit the humility as well to kind of mix in the external environment into what you do. Some people like to invest into startup because then they get a close aspect. I think we've liked better to use kind of some of the connectors to directors to some of the resources. But this would be the three aspects I would highlight as a start.
Interesting, and definitely pretty cool. So executive sponsorship, I think this has come a lot in our previous conversation as well. Like, what are some of your say ninja techniques when it comes to securing executive sponsorship? Like, what are some of the suggestions that you would give to anyone seeking to leaders buy into their vision of any thoughts there?
Yeah, so the way I approach this, we talked about this often with colleagues, is you need to find the right approach, right? You need to understand, I think, the culture of your company. How do things get decided? You need to understand as well how information is shared. You need to basically start with the circle of first level understanding of if you want the governing mechanisms of how things work, right? So this is the start, and there you have to probably bucket a little bit the things that are maybe color coded, right? The things that are a little bit green, where that the things will work out, people will give you a thumbs up and they will move, or the things that are red, where that if you're coming in a way with a presentation or something that you're presenting and it doesn't have the minimum requirement, it's going to be sidelining, right? And I think where we've been operating is a little bit in the orange or gray zone in the middle, right? And what we're trying to do is, every time we present or we interact and others, is kind of linking a little bit, and I think this is something that a lot of listeners would relate to, related to the overall strategic objectives, and finding a way, if you want to bridge the gap with the kind of innovation aspects, right? Take the sharing economy. It probably wouldn't fit within one of the top strategic objectives because we don't have anything to deploy. But sure enough, right? You can relate this to maybe new ways of transactioning in casualty and liability in our case, and then the role basically becomes how to a certain extent borrow a little bit from the startup. I think we take a lot of cues from the entrepreneurs and the startup. So again, the word entrepreneurs come to mind. So maybe the intra piece is what I was discussing before. Make sure you respect the basics of communications, of course, line management, relationship, meetings, and the code. But then, try to borrow as well from the entrepreneur, right? Hack maybe your way into some of the discussion. Sometimes, and this is also something that we're starting to see is you can find different person also from external that can be kind of validating some of the things you do. I think you have to be a little bit kind of navigating this two world. And I think if there's one summary on this point, I'm sure that a lot of listeners will relate to this, is you're always a little bit on the line, right? I mean, you're in between this kind of external way of doing things where you're going very fast, things very exciting, and you have to translate this into a way that is kind of understandable, digestible, and actionable from the executive. And your role, I think, in this lab is to be at the juncture of these two things.
We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast. Thank you so much for walking us through that. So one thing that I picked from your profile and the companies that you worked for, like almost everyone is either like they're transcontinental, not even transnational. So they are spread apart. They're all over the place, and like every geoloco had their own sort of focus and doing their own thing. And when you are asked to put up so-called venture lab or so-called catalyst, so-called lab, like what are some of the things that you think you do that one does differently than when it comes to, say, a US company trying to create a US lab or something? So what are some of the extra headaches or challenges, so to speak, that would come to your mind that you have to keep an eye on when you're designing something like this?
Right. Well, that's very interesting, and we haven't done this, but I would say between Europe and the US, we've seen with some of our partners that you can actually try and to a certain extent replicate or use the partnerships. I mean, it's public knowledge, but we are partner to give an example with Mass Challenge, that is a global accelerator, if you want, and we've been able to really kind of do a couple things well in different places, right? So this is, for example, having access to what you could call solutions, right? You give typically accelerator a list of saying, well, I need an IoT company that can be kind of using sensors so that I can use raw data to do activities. And you can do, if you want, things in parallel and run things a little bit in parallel with, in the end, of course, strong links to your headquarters where obviously most of the people are. I think as you're adding up one more, if we had to add, for example, something in Asia, then it will become a little bit more difficult, because if you want the aspect of localizing into the ecosystem would be very, very different. But I would say, as a company, what we try to do is not kind of be over presence everywhere, but select a couple of partners in each of the locations where we are, and I think they'll act a little bit as our anchor. And rather than, again, kind of multiplying all our efforts, is use these kind of first partners to grow. So we have a different, again, kind of academic, even investors, partners in each, and they basically become a little bit the anchor. Then I think to your point also on maybe the organization, where it becomes very interesting is that then you have a regional, if you want, loop that starts happening. We have our headquarters not too far away here in New York, and what has been really also very interesting is to see how we can kind of use a little bit this proximity to bring people in. So if one thing that I could add there is, I think having the opportunity of bringing, if you want, your internal colleagues into your environment, into this kind of lab environment, I think is extremely important. Again, I think it would look different in each place. This is maybe more something that's there, but some sort of, deep dive or programs. And we've had, for example, also the role of helping some of the team with their own projects to come over here. And I would say this has been something that grew a little bit naturally, but we saw a lot of value.
Interesting. Makes perfect sense. So now let's talk about some of the challenges. That you face in your current infrastructure. So what are also your current setup, or personally when you're putting up a analytics digital analytics catalyst. So if you can shed some light there.
Yeah, of course. I mean, one of the challenge has to do obviously with the industry, right? It was very interesting coming from outside the industry that every time I was saying, no, you cannot do this, no, you cannot do that, because you have this kind of regulatory environment to work with. So it's a little bit like this cat and mouse game where, one door comes in and another opens. You have to really navigate a complex environment. It's not impossible, but it's an additional way of working when, even like predictive analytics, that's a big deal, right? For example, for underwriting, not every regulator is there, or just kind of, using data and others. I think there's lots of things that we have to put into a frame, again, to my points earlier, that's kind of fairly rigid. So that's been one thing. I would say the second thing has been really also back to one of your earlier points, is how do we, if you want to take everything that we see externally, the richness of the contact, the technology, the potential, and kind of channel this into something that's actionable, measurable, and will kind of, bear actions moving forward. And this brings in the third one, which is creating a portfolio of activity that's balanced. I think that's something that's really difficult. You don't want to go only for what you could call the quick win, right? Where, you connect one person, you start a small project. You also want to have something that might have a little bit more kind of time to market, or that will make time to explore. But it's gonna take quite a bit of time, right? So building up the portfolio has been it's been certainly a challenge. And then finally, I would add the fact that there's, again, talking of gap, quite a bit of education to be done. So we tend to be fast in the team because we all been involved in one way or another with either startup or technology related ways. So we need to derive as well the right way of working with colleagues, maybe sometimes a little bit the patience to a certain extent to make things go forward.
Interesting. I think as you were talking about the challenges or that you're seeing today, one thing that came to my mind was like how to build, like, so what are the best player that you would have in your team. So what are some of the interesting profile that either you have or you want to see, or at least if someone is asked to put up a lab or catalyst, these are like 3 or 4 personalities that would be amazing to have. So what are some of the thoughts there?
So I think we got lucky, and honestly, I think you'll see more and more of this in the insurance industry, right? People that have an interest for data science, analytics, even just kind of mathematics. Is, after all, I like to say it's mathematics and regulation, as we said before, right? So both lawyers and data scientists will be happy there. The profile for me are, again, kind of people that can bridge different aspects, have first a little bit of an expertise. We have someone in the team who's just a world-class doer in IoT. We have another woman that's really strong in digital health. So I think you need to place your bets on some persons that have at least the potential to really be kind of taking advantage of their knowledge of the field, kind of growing this as an aspect. But then I think more importantly is the ability to implement, move things forward, and execute. And I think this is where there's this big talk about growth hacking in marketing. This is the equivalent of growth hacking for, if you want, a slow moving. So it's basically maybe implementation hacking, right? What are the tools? What are the next steps? How do you get more of the budget? How do you move forward? And I think this is kind of a specific type of person that can have kind of the different skills. But I would say this piece on really making sure that things move forward, a little bit the kind of resiliency as well to go through this is extremely important to my sense. So we have, former entrepreneurs, we have people that were working in some of the large institutions around, but I think all of us are driven really by the desire to make things a little bit move forward without having any roadmap as well, like little supervision, little roadmap. And it might look a little bit cliche, but if projects don't work out, it's fine, right?
Yeah.
There's certainly an appetite for, if not failure, at least challenging and changing conditions.
It's well said. Well said. I think, Pascal. I love it. So, one interesting thing that we hear a lot from the labs infrastructure, right? So many and I don't know, as you rightly said, you're experimenting with your catalyst, or where it goes and where it is. So one thing that we heard about is, so lab has in its own way, its own pace to innovate, to bring innovation, to recruit innovation, to incubate something, to get something validated pretty quickly, or whichever pace it goes with. But normally the companies that are pursuing those labs, and I think you briefly touched in your previous conversations, that it takes their own time. It's a cultural fit. There's a process. You need to get buy-ins. You need to get sponsors, and all that fun stuff. So, what are some of the jitters, or some of the like how to match the two, how to match the misconception between how fast the lab goes vis-a-vis what any big corporation which is heavily regulated could progress with innovation.
So I think there again, I don't think there's any magic formula, right? You can again bring the example of some of the clients, because any company is making money. If your clients are innovating at a pace that's higher than yours, maybe that's a signal for your company, right? So I would say, if I had to do there a little brief for an executive, I would say, let's look at the lab of one of the top insurance company. Let's measure the output. Let's measure maybe the number of products in any given years and others, or ideas that come out. Even just kind of measuring some of the white papers is pretty interesting, because I think it gives you a little sense of how much research and activities have been put out there. Again, some of them have labs that are even semi-open. So this would be one way, would be kind of externally. What I found more interesting to do internally is activities that have been looking at doing a little bit similar things within the company, and from there on, if you want, kind of making sure that we connect to those. And to a certain extent, this is where it's becoming a larger team effort, and it's a collective play, right? You're not necessarily working only for your projects, but you're basically trying to accelerate, boost, facilitate the knowledge of others, and raising maybe the innovation capabilities of different groups. I think that's one way that you can accelerate some of those projects.
Interesting. And I think one thing that also I like about your profile was your experience with transformational leadership, right? So again, so when we think about transforming, say, financial services or an insurance, like heavy vertical, which are very regulated, big in size, and then you have these labs, right? So how do they mess around with the original transformation of how the company? So like what is the future through this lab? Because these labs are critical, right? So now every business is seeing attention deficit disorder, right? So every business is now
That's a great question, and I think on that, I can only repeat a little bit sometimes the mission that we're being given is you guys will be measured by the rate at which you'll make yourself redundant. I think that's a good way to do it, right? Your mission might change, the topic might change, but the true success, and I'm not entirely sure that's absolutely true, but it's maybe the day where other parts of the group will appropriate themselves the methodologies, will take over some of the projects, or will start their own managing their own partnership externally. So if I had to kind of build up a little bit the lab's future, if you want, is like trying to cut a little bit across the different pieces of the company and try to see where basically we can house some of the various pieces of the puzzles that we've been building. And I think for labs this is typically a way to kind of evolve as well. Again, I mean, another aspect would be to say you focused initially internally, and then you kind of start going externally. This might be another way, or something that would be extremely interesting to see. You start to see this, and very often it started mostly out of rather than inside the industry, but maybe it becomes a more kind of collective approach of what you can be doing. Maybe there's enough potential to do things at scale right from the beginning and do it with other partners from the industry than just yours. So I think as every entrepreneur, the lab itself should have its own kind of exit strategy, and it speaks to some of the comments we made earlier, right? It speaks to the persons that you want to have work with you. It speaks to the kind of timeline that you have to choose for project. If something will last 10 years of development and hundreds of millions, you're probably out of the scope of any lab. And finally, it speaks also a little bit about the mindset of how you kind of manage it on a day-to-day basis.
No, absolutely. I think rightly said, because it's yet to see, at least in the insurance company, right? So I spoke to like a lot of insurance leaders from top insurance in US, and almost everyone is I can feel the sense of the frustration for at least people who are either on the innovation end or either whether it's claims, whether it's commercial, whether it's personal lines, wherever you are, that their ability or what the innovation framework demand vis-a-vis what really insurance can adhere, and that mismatch sort of so it's just a tug of war between many of these. And I think that's why I have so much respect for like you and anyone who's sort of disrupting that vertical. And I'm not sure how besides giving them a free access to hot yoga or whatever, how you can sort of pacify the leaders to just like amp or prep the organizational culture to sort of innovate through this innovative frameworks. Because when you have your business on ADHD, how can you innovate in that quorum?
Right.
So interesting. So let's talk about some of the KPIs. You as a leader, or you as sort of as a head of a catalyst, that you need to worry on sort of, or at least anyone who's actually putting up a catalyst or a lab together. What are some of the KPIs that they would be that comes to your mind that they should keep an eye on?
Yeah. So I would look at kind of three groups. The first one, it's what you can measure with your eye, right? Which is the portfolio, like how many projects, what's the stage of implementation, which kind of support are you getting, what are the partners externally, internally that you have, a little bit the storyline, but more than that, the potential for things to go on. So that's one way to look at it. It's a little bit your output, and this I think is fairly well known. The second part I think is more for me on how do you bring this within the organization, right? So how many groups you're partnering with, what are the levels of kind of visitors that comes to see you, how can you kind of make things happen in partnership with some of the other person. Again, something that you can just measure by the level of interaction and your kind of relationship making, and I'd say kind of building up the network internally as well, because a lab is just as good as its position within a company, especially for something like we're doing, which is kind of based on, as I said, kind of very multiple teams, right? It's not where you can build an iPhone and then just kind of roll it out. You need to be extremely close to the group, even though you want to be outside for generating some of the kind of entrepreneurial DNA. And then the last part I would say is what's a little bit the mind share, right? How does your group gets kind of cited, seen on the intranet, understood by executives, and maybe externally as well, right? Because in the end, there's also a fair amount of noise out there. Is what is a little bit the kind of reputation you're building as in an ecosystem like Boston? I mean, do opportunities come also a little bit your way? Do you find that people engage with you in all kinds of activities? I would use also this as another one of the KPI to measure what we're doing.
Interesting. So let's talk about while we're at KPI. What's your KPI? Like, what's your personal best practices? That's your key to success. That you really very
Yeah.
adamant on.
Yeah. So I think, for me, I'm looking at it through the eyes of a team, right? The personal KPI or the one that I think is the best is like, how far do we develop ourselves, right? And I think that's a great way to see, how you've added value on some of the projects, what you've learned, how much you've kind of built up everyone. So I want to see all of us within the team basically move on, if you want, in terms of what we can contribute and how. And I'm not saying necessarily career-wise. I hope that career-wise there's, obviously a reward attached to some of the risk that we are doing. But I'm more thinking of it in a way as to say, do we get also the kind of trust and confidence and do we get, again, kind of the, I would say, stickiness within some of the groups that we're developing. So I think that's the KPI, because in the end, I think the transformation, if we go back to the digital transformation, happens through people, right? So the more you can kind of do this either on a large scale by doing group work, webinars and others, but also you can do through collaboration on projects and some of this team, I think the faster your digital transformation. So for me, kind of this digital DNA piece, if you want, is core to the success, and that's how I would measure the metrics more than some of the maybe kind of specific projects.
Interesting. And while we are at personal KPIs, I think one thing I definitely need your input on is your prophecy on insurance industry.
Yeah.
So I think I've been in one of the conversation talking with one of the insurance executive talking about I think autonomous vehicle, and how autonomous vehicle now, with all the IoT and sensory data, like many of these vendors would probably take insurance in their own hand because they have a better understanding of the risk and all that. So what are some of the indicators or some of your thinkings around where the future of insurance and the reinsurer would be in 5 to 10 years?
So I think you'll see a lot of adaptation rather than disruption. And it's interesting to see in the conversation we're having. Of course, it's been also well published, but there's a very collaborative activity. It's honestly hard enough to be an insurance company that you don't want to become an insurance company. So I think the best ideas out there. I doubt that there's a sufficiently solid aspect of really kind of becoming a large company, which means that there's certainly an advantage for some of the established player. Therefore, the prophecy, if you want, moving forward, will be how you're going to use the amazing sources of technology to do your business better than your competitors, right? And again, I think it has kind of different pockets of activities. What we see now, what we started to see, is that definitely a value added and kind of a customer attractiveness if you can be digital. So the first aspect will be certainly, can you have a fully digital experience to offer to your clients? And I think there you'll see some early winners. You see some of the large companies where you can start on your mobile, be omni-channels, and others. So I think you'd see this if you want as a first aspect, which I found very interesting. A second aspect linked to maybe what you were saying, be it IoT or other sources of data, is you will see risk being managed in a very different way, right? I mean, health risk, for example, is going to be kind of completely changing, because now, again, we can know much better how people are and what they're doing, which brings the next level where I think insurance will be not only a payment premium and kind of, claim payment play, if you want, but really embedded into a full kind of, service aspect. Will it be embedded into your product, like a lot of people are talking about when you say autonomous vehicle and Tesla? Possibly, but I can see insurance companies becoming much better at being part of the overall, prevention if it comes, to health and disease, kind of, risk prevention when it comes to some of the aspect of a home, for example. I think you're going to see a lot more services that will come out of it, just because these services will reinforce the core business of insurance. And then I think finally, if you look at it from the reinsurance perspective, is in between, new risk like cyber that will kind of have an exploding growth, and risk that might disappear like auto. You're going to see a shift as well on how we can see and adapt to large risk, and certainly new stakeholders coming in, right? We see governments now, for example, being much more interested in managing some of the large risk linked to climate change. I think, again, large company, when it comes to cyber, will have a lot of things to do. So I think you'll have new player, new entrants, and a little bit of a reshuffling of the risk in different ways.
I think interesting. So one conversation that comes to my mind. So I was talking to one of the chief risk officer of one of the large bank, and he was discussing, Vishal, what keeps me up at night? A bank cannot be a software, but a software can be a bank, right?
Yeah.
And it's just the regulation that's holding us back and giving us that security net. But and I think we saw briefly that moment in insurance with Lemonade and like all these guys emerging. It's like Uberification of so-called insurance. So what are some of the safety nets or safety shields that you think that current either executives on insurance company, or at least these heavily regulated industry, which are now protected by trade or by government, but could actually, the moment that piece is shifted, they would be vulnerable to any cool software eating their pie. Like, what are some of your thinking on? And I think that's why I'm a big fan that you doing a catalyst and all. I think that's one. But what are some of the things that insurance guys could do to save themselves?
Right. Well, again, I think you have an expertise. Again, I'm starting with the people part of the business, but you have an expertise that you're not going to find anywhere else. Again, kind of understanding how to price your risk, underwrite it, putting the reserve and others, it's just not something that you can kind of recreate overnight. I think you mentioned Lemonade, and this is certainly something that they spend a lot of time on. Obviously, they take a different approach than some others. So I think, just kind of this aspect of the industry and this knowledge will be something that certainly you can buy out, but it's going to be expensive. And this is kind of a little bit of special sauce, if you want, that will certainly kind of carry forward, even if software is going to eat the world in the future, right? Then you obviously have the capital aspect. You might say, low interest rates, plenty of capital, private equity and others would be very interesting in trading risk, certainly. But it remains that, you never too far away from something that can wipe out quite a bit of reserves. So I think, there's also this kind of a little bit safety, security links to the regulator that is there. And then I would say that I think the insurance industry is in movement, right? The actuarial persons are learning to work with the data scientists. Some of the large companies are certainly going to be working a little bit closer with the insurance group. So I think to a certain extent, if there was one comfort to be had, is that these conversations are starting to happen. And to finish on this, maybe on one of the point I was doing first, is we're getting some very interesting people in the industry. And I think for me that's a good signal, right? I think if you're able to kind of also generate an exciting place to work where, the new PhD will be, doing all of the work, or if a professor comes to you and say, hey, I've been willing to, test my model on catastrophe, and I think now, we're talking peer to peer. I think if you have this as a signal, it's probably also some comforts that something good is happening in the industry.
Right. No, I think that well said, and that reminds me about one of the conversation I had with I think FICO or one of those guys. So it's around changing risk profiles, and I think definitely I want your quick perspective on that. So we are seeing now cybersecurity is in the picture now with IoT. I'm wearing bunch of IoTs now, and the moment I end up in Europe, and I was talking to one of the GE's executive on like the IoT have no sense of trade laws, right? So IoT is just sort of sharing data with this master, and somehow many of these guys are AI loaded, so they can just negotiate the best route and all that, right? So now trade has no respect for, or at least no tolerance to technology, like how rapidly technology is going, because they care about people, and technology has no respect for trade because they cannot wait for trade to happen before they disrupt, right? So how would insurance companies cope up with this changing risk profiles, because they have primarily been a passive risk calculator, but now we are with this IoT, we can calculate risk on a real time and sort of be more active than reactive. So how are these insurance coping up? If you can shed some light on that.
Yeah. So I mean, you see some of this happening already in some lines, right? Think about telematics, for example. I can be, driving my car with just my cell phone, and within, a couple drives, you would know exactly how to price me, or at least the risk that I represent. And that's an amazing development, right? You don't need any kind of specific software, just kind of your phone will be enough. This you can see already in Europe being implemented, and I think this is going to be risk reduction. People say that after a while you forget that someone is kind of tracking a little bit how you drive, but I think if your insurance company is there to kind of coach you in the back, this can have an impact, right? If we look at IoT for buildings or for things that are a little bit larger, cargo and others, again, I think this is where I see a little bit this kind of embeddedness into services, right? This is where I think insurance will be now either a little bit kind of as the backbone of any of the transcontinental service that you can roll out, where it can be kind of an add-on to something that already happens, where it can be also to a certain extent maybe more and more parametric. I think that's a big deal in the industry, right? We've been working, for example, on a flight delay program, which is kind of full digital, full parametric. So I think you'll see some of this happening as well, where the risk, the claim, and others are embedded into some of this IoT and AI that you were describing, where basically the data speaks a little bit for itself, which obviously means kind of a completely different product and services. And then I think finally, it's going to be more interesting to see on the personal side, right? How does this kind of data explosion links to privacy? I think this is one of, for me, the big battle in the future, or if not battle, at least one of the big discussion from the industry. It's going to look certainly different in Europe than in the US, right? We have just to see some of the large giants of tech to see how different the privacy looks like and in different work. But I think this is certainly one of the very exciting challenge that will happen in the future, because of course the data is going to be there. What I'm hoping is that as a future person that has all of this data, I might actually keep enough control of it myself, right? So think about it. There's a couple of companies that are working on this, but creating a little bit your personal data treasury, and then using this as a way to kind of negotiate, obviously with financial services, with healthcare, or why not, might be a very interesting way forward. So on the personal side, it might actually give you back some of what you had lost if some companies are smart about doing it.
Interesting, and thank you so much for sharing that. So I think we are almost at the tail end of our conversation. So one thing that definitely ask every sort of interviewee in the podcast is their favorite read. So is there any read that you want to share with our audience, and why you love it, and what? So
Well, it's just the last one I read, which I found really interesting. Is trying sometimes, to take the next step and try to put where we're living into a little bit of a broader perspective. And I think it has helped me because, again, being new to the insurance industry, I only see like this small piece of the movie. And the book that I was reading recently was Sapiens, right? Which is this kind of history of humanity. I know that a lot of people have read it, but if I look at it, I've used some of the ways to kind of unpack, almost millions of years of history, to unpack, 150 years of history in insurance. So this has been my read there when I'm not reading some of the tech stuff and things like this. It's been a good read. Other than this, there's a few really kind of cool newsletter that I don't want to miss. A little plug for Coverager, for example, because it's just a fun read and mixing a little bit of an industry and some laugh and technology into the same newsletter. Well done. I don't miss an issue on this one.
Interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that. So and again, Pascal, thank you so much for your time. I think it was a ball. And but as before we part ways, what are some of your closing remarks for our audience?
Yeah, no, just I think interesting to see how basically, again, this kind of tech wave is reaching yet another industry. And I think it will be very interesting to see which directions it takes. So if there's entrepreneurs out there, just kind of an open invitation to look into it. Also open invitation because I'm sure there's data scientists out there. I don't think there's any more fascinating place now that have, again, a wide variety of topics, an expertise that has been building up over 100 years, and the potential to basically shape what will be the future of what is a $1 trillion industry in the US alone. So you're really talking about a big piece there. And again, I think very excited to be part of this group and looking forward to exchanging online or offline more with some of the listeners.
Again, Pascal, thank you so much, and good luck with digital analytic catalyst in insurance. So definitely 4 mountains right there, battling it out, and love to have you back sometime in future talking about your journey and sharing some of other insights. And thank you so much for candidly discussing with our communities what all migrants insurance are facing today and how they can cope up with that, and truly appreciate your time here.
Congrats. Looking forward to it. Bye-bye.
Bye. So.
I thought I was sick of home, but actually I was homesick. Never really knew that I would have to grow up so quick. I'm so uncomfortable, don't know anybody here. Just a couple dudes that I met once, that's it. And I go into the booth feeling nervous. Got butterflies in my stomach like I'm so worthless. Is the mic on? I don't know how to work this. Inside I'm breaking down, I hope I'm not up on the